Summer of 1975. A time of music on the boardwalk, the scent of sunscreen in the air, and the quiet innocence of youth. 12-year-old twin sisters, Laura and Sarah, stepped out their front door for an afternoon of play and vanished without a trace. Their disappearance became a ghost story, a wound in the town's heart that never truly healed. Search teams gave up. Newspaper headlines faded, and the case slowly went cold, buried beneath layers of time, like a secret lost beneath the shifting sands. Until one day, nearly 4 decades later, when a K9 search dog, acting on nothing but stubborn instinct, refused its handler's command, and that moment pulled back the curtain on one of the most heartbreaking truths ever hidden. Before we begin, if you enjoy stories like this one, make sure to subscribe, turn on notifications, and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. We always love knowing how far these quiet stories can travel. Now, let's follow the dog and retrace the very first step. The month of October has a way of quieting the Jersey Shore. The boisterous laughter of summer vacationers fades into the whisper of the wind, and the vibrant boardwalks of towns like Haven Point settle into a peaceful, almost melancholic slumber. Sergeant Michael Connolly of the Haven Point Police Department had brought his K9 partner, a German shepherd named Scout, to the undeveloped northern dunes for a routine training exercise. This stretch of coastline was a wild place, a tangle of seagrass, gnarled scrub pines, and rolling dunes that stood as a natural barrier against the Atlantic's fury. It was a place few people ever visited, save for the occasional fisherman or a solitary soul seeking communion with the sea. The air was crisp, carrying the salty, briny scent of low tide. Scout, usually a model of discipline, was working a search grid with focused intensity. Connolly watched him, his breath misting in the cool air, a sense of routine comfort settling over him. It was a good day, a quiet day, and then everything changed. Scout, in the middle of his pattern, stopped dead. His head snapped to the side, his ears perked, his entire body locked in a posture of sudden, intense interest. It wasn't the alert posture Connolly had trained him for, the signal for a hidden training object. This was something else, something primal. "What is it, boy?" Connolly called out, his voice calm, masking the flicker of curiosity. Scout ignored him. He lowered his nose to the sand, sniffing frantically at a spot near the base of a large, windswept dune. A low whine escaped his throat, a sound of anxious discovery. And then, he began to dig. Not playfully, but with a desperate, almost frantic energy. Sand flew in arcs behind him as his powerful paws tore at the ground. Connolly walked over, a frown creasing his brow. "Scout, heel," he commanded. The dog, for the first time in their 3 years together, disobeyed. He continued to dig, his whining growing more insistent, his focus absolute. Connolly knew, in that gut-level way a K9 handler knows his partner, that this was no drill. Scout had found something real. He knelt beside the dog, placing a hand on his quivering back. "Easy, boy, easy." He peered into the shallow hole Scout had created. At first, he saw nothing but damp, dark sand and the tangled roots of beach grass. But as Scout clawed away another layer, something pale and oddly shaped emerged. Connolly's breath caught in his throat. It was bone, unmistakably bone, long, slender, and tinged yellow with age. He gently pulled Scout back, his heart now hammering against his ribs. Using his gloved hands, he carefully brushed away more sand. The shape became clearer. It looked like a human forearm. He stood up slowly, his eyes scanning the desolate landscape. The sound of the waves seemed to retreat, replaced by a profound and heavy silence. He pulled out his radio, his hand steady despite the tremor running through him. "Dispatch, this is Sergeant Connolly," he said, his voice low and even. "I'm at the North Dunes, Grid 7. I need a forensics team and a detective out here. Immediately." "Copy, Sergeant," the voice on the other end crackled. "What's the situation?" Connolly looked down at the hole, at the silent testament half buried in the sand. I think I've found a grave site." Within the hour, the quiet dune was transformed. The area was cordoned off with yellow tape that flapped violently in the wind, a stark slash of color against the muted landscape. A team of forensic anthropologists worked with the quiet, meticulous precision of surgeons, their brushes and trowels moving with reverent care. As the afternoon wore on, the initial discovery grew into a far more somber reality. It was not one set of remains. It was two. Two skeletons, laid closely together, their bones intertwined in a way that suggested they had been placed there at the same time, perhaps even holding onto one another. The forensic team noted they were small, their skeletal structures suggesting they were adolescents, likely female. The news spread through the small police department like a quiet shockwave. Haven Point was not a town accustomed to such grim findings. It was a place of summer memories and tight-knit families. A place where the worst crimes were usually petty thefts and the occasional boardwalk scuffle. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, casting long, mournful shadows across the sand, the lead detective on the scene, a young, sharp-eyed woman named Isabella Rossi, stood beside the excavated grave. She looked at the two skeletons, now almost fully uncovered, lying in their sandy tomb. The questions hung in the salty air, heavy and unanswered. They were young. They had died together, and someone had taken great care to bury them here, in this lonely, forgotten corner of the world, hoping the ocean and the ever-shifting sands would keep their secret forever. "Who are you?" Detective Rossi whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. "And who brought you here?" The answer to Detective Rossi's whispered question would not come from the sand, but from the sterile, quiet confines of a state forensics lab. Weeks after the discovery in the dunes, a technician in a white coat stared at a computer screen, watching as two DNA profiles, extracted with painstaking effort from the ancient bones, found their match in the National Database for Missing Persons. The result was a direct hit, a digital ghost rising from a file that hadn't been opened in decades. The report landed on Rossi's desk, and the names on the page sent a jolt through the cold case files of Haven Point. The remains belonged to Laura and Sarah Peterson, twin sisters, vanished on a hot July afternoon in 1975. The news rippled backward through time, pulling the story away from the stark, windswept dunes of 2014 and back to a sun-drenched summer nearly 40 years earlier. The summer of 1975 was a golden time in Haven Point. The air was thick with the smell of saltwater taffy and hot dogs from the boardwalk vendors. The sound of carnival music and the delighted shrieks of children riding the tilt-a-whirl drifted over the town, a constant, joyful soundtrack to the season. For the Peterson family, it was a summer like any other, filled with the simple, cherished routines of life in a beach town. David Peterson, a high school history teacher, spent his days off fixing things around their small clapboard house on Maple Avenue. His wife, Eleanor, a librarian, cultivated a garden bursting with hydrangeas and fiery red tomatoes. But the true heart of their home, the source of its light and laughter, was their 12-year-old twin daughters, Laura and Sarah. They were identical in appearance, with the same sun-streaked blonde hair and eyes the color of the summer sea, but their spirits were a study in gentle contrasts. Laura was the quiet observer, a thoughtful girl who loved to read, her nose always buried in a book borrowed from her mother's library. Sarah was the adventurer, her knees perpetually scraped from climbing trees, her laughter a bright, bubbly sound that could coax a smile from anyone. They were two halves of a perfect whole, rarely seen without the other. On the morning of July 15th, the heat was already settling over Haven Point like a heavy blanket. The girls, fresh from their 12th birthday, approached their mother in the kitchen, their faces alight with a carefully rehearsed proposal. "Mom," Sarah began, her voice brimming with excitement, "can we, please, can we go to the boardwalk by ourselves today?" Eleanor paused, her hands still in the soapy dishwater. She looked at her daughters, standing on the cusp of teenagehood, their eyes pleading. They had been asking for this for weeks. It was a rite of passage in Haven Point, the first solo trip to the boardwalk, to spend their allowance on ice cream and skee ball without a parent hovering nearby. "I don't know, girls," David said, walking in from the back porch. He was a cautious man by nature. "There are a lot of summer crowds down there. But we'll be careful, Dad. We promise," Laura added, her quiet voice lending a serious weight to the plea. "We'll stick together the whole time. We won't talk to strangers. We know all the rules." Eleanor looked at David, a silent conversation passing between them. They were good girls, responsible girls, and they were right. All their friends were already allowed. Maybe it was time. "All right," Eleanor said finally, a smile softening her features. "But you have to be home by 5 o'clock." Not a minute later. "We're having spaghetti for dinner, and I want you at the table." A twin chorus of joyous "thank you" filled the small kitchen. Eleanor gave them each $2 from her purse, a small fortune for a 12-year-old in 1975. They promised again to be careful, to be home on time, their voices overlapping in their excitement. Eleanor walked them to the front door, watching as they started down the tree-lined street, their matching denim shorts and bright yellow t-shirts a beacon in the summer sun. They turned at the corner, two identical figures, and waved. Eleanor waved back, a lump forming in her throat. It was just a feeling, a mother's fleeting worry as she watches her children take their first small steps toward independence. She watched until they disappeared from view. And then, in the present, a different memory surfaced, sharp and cold. It was the voice of Eleanor Peterson, now in her late 70s, speaking to Detective Rossi over the phone just a day ago, her voice thin and fragile with age and grief. Rossi had asked her to describe that last moment, and Eleanor's words came back to her now, a haunting echo across the years. "If I had known," Eleanor had whispered, her voice cracking. "If I had known that was the last time I would ever see them, that wave, that final smile, I would have run after them. I would have held them and never let them go. If I had just said no, then maybe 40 years of my life wouldn't have been spent waiting for a ghost to walk through my door." The clock on the kitchen wall of the Peterson home ticked past 5 o'clock on that sweltering July evening in 1975. The spaghetti was cooked, the sauce was simmering, but the two chairs at the dinner table remained empty. Eleanor stood by the screen door, peering down the street, a knot of annoyance tightening in her stomach. The girls were never late. By 6 o'clock, annoyance had curdled into a genuine, gnawing fear. David began to pace the length of their small living room, his calm demeanor worn thin. He called the parents of their closest friends. No one had seen them since midday. At 7, with the sun beginning to bleed into a bruised purple and orange sunset, David Peterson made the phone call that would irrevocably divide their lives into a before and an after. The case landed on the desk of Detective Frank Miller. Miller was a Haven Point man, born and raised. He was a 20-year veteran of the force, a man with a weary face and kind eyes who believed in the fundamental goodness of his town. He had seen his share of summer troubles, but a report of two missing 12-year-old girls sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the evening air. He drove to the Peterson house himself, finding a home suspended in a state of quiet panic. He sat with Eleanor and David at their kitchen table, his large hands wrapped around a mug of coffee he didn't drink. He listened patiently as they recounted the day, his pen scratching across his notepad. His initial assessment was what he told them, a practiced reassurance. They probably lost track of time, met some friends, and would be home soon, full of apologies. But the look in Eleanor's eyes told him she didn't believe it. And deep down, neither did he. By the next morning, what had been a missing persons report had escalated into a full-blown search operation. The disappearance of the Peterson twins seized Haven Point with a terrifying grip. The carefree summer atmosphere evaporated overnight, replaced by a collective, fearful holding of breath. Detective Miller organized the largest search in the town's history. Police officers, volunteer firefighters, and eventually, hundreds of civilian volunteers fanned out across the small town. They combed every inch of the mile-long stretch of beach between the Petersons' home and the boardwalk, their feet sinking into the sand as they called out the girls' names, their voices swallowed by the relentless roar of the ocean. They searched the winding back alleys behind the shops, the shadowy spaces beneath the boardwalk, the vacant lots overgrown with weeds. The Coast Guard sent out boats to scan the waters, their powerful searchlights cutting through the darkness of the nights that followed. But there was nothing. No footprints that could be definitively identified. No discarded piece of clothing. No witnesses who had seen them in distress. It was as if the girls had walked out of their front door and simply dissolved into the humid summer air. Miller and his small team of detectives worked around the clock, fueled by stale coffee and a growing sense of desperation. They meticulously retraced the girls' probable route. They interviewed every shopkeeper, every ride operator, every ticket taker on the boardwalk. The story they pieced together was frustratingly incomplete. Several people remembered seeing the twins. A woman who ran a cotton candy stand recalled selling them a large pink cone to share around 1 o'clock. The man who operated the skee-ball alley remembered their bright laughter as they pooled their money to win a small stuffed bear. The last credible sighting was from a teenage lifeguard who saw them walking near the pier around 3 o'clock, heading in the general direction of home. After that, the trail went cold. Days turned into a week. The national news outlets descended on Haven Point, their vans and cameras a jarring presence in the small town. The faces of Laura and Sarah Peterson, smiling from a recent school photograph, were suddenly everywhere, on telephone poles, in shop windows, on the evening news. The reward fund, started by local businesses, grew steadily. Tips poured in from all over the country, each one a fleeting spark of hope that was painstakingly investigated and ultimately extinguished. A trucker in Ohio thought he saw them at a rest stop. A tourist in Florida was sure they were the girls she saw at a motel. Each lead was a dead end, another turn in a labyrinth of false hope. There was no ransom note, no call demanding money, which ruled out a kidnapping for profit and pointed towards something far more sinister. Miller began to focus on the people who worked the boardwalk, a transient population of summer employees who came and went with the season. He and his team interviewed dozens of them, college kids, drifters, men trying to make a few bucks before moving on. Among them was a man named Raymond Ray Finch. He was in his late 20s, a quiet, unassuming man who operated the Ferris wheel. Miller remembered the interview, conducted in a stuffy, temporary office behind the police station. Finch had been nervous, his eyes darting around the room, his hands fidgeting. But that wasn't unusual. Most people were nervous when talking to the police. He claimed he had been working his shift all afternoon, and then went straight to a local diner for dinner. He even produced a receipt from his wallet, dated July 15th, with a timestamp of 4:45 p.m. It seemed to check out. He was just one of dozens of interviews, a face in a crowd of tired, anxious people. Yet, something about Finch nagged at Miller. It was a detective's instinct, that unquantifiable feeling that something was off. The man's anxiety seemed a little too sharp, his answers a little too rehearsed. After the interview, Miller sat in his car and made a note in his personal, dog-eared notebook, the one he kept separate from the official case files. He wrote the date, and next to it, a single line, Finch. Something not right, but nothing to hold him. It was a whisper of a lead, a gut feeling without evidence to support it. In an investigation drowning in a sea of dead ends and false sightings, a single, unsubstantiated feeling wasn't enough. There were other, more promising avenues to explore, other, more suspicious individuals to vet. The investigation moved on, and Ray Finch, along with Miller's handwritten note, was buried under the growing mountain of paperwork. The trail, which had once seemed so vital, had finally, and completely, gone cold. For Frank Miller, the silence that followed was the most damning sound of all. It was the sound of failure, a sound that would echo in his ears for the rest of his career and long into his retirement. For 39 years, the case file of Laura and Sarah Peterson sat in the cold case archives of the Haven Point Police Department. It grew thick with age, the paper yellowed and brittle, a heavy testament to a generation's failure and a community's lasting wound. The town of Haven Point moved on, as towns do. New families moved in, new shops opened on the boardwalk, and the story of the missing twins slowly faded from headlines into local legend, a ghost story told to warn children about the dangers of the world. But for the department, and for the few who remembered, the file remained a heavy, unopened book. Until now, the discovery in the dunes had changed everything. The case was no longer a cold file of missing persons. It was an active homicide investigation, and it was assigned to Detective Isabella Izzy Rossi. Detective Rossi was, in almost every way, the antithesis of the weary, old-school detective Frank Miller had been. She was in her early 30s, with a sharp, analytical mind that thrived on data, patterns, and digital forensics. Where Miller had relied on instinct and shoe-leather police work, Rossi trusted technology and meticulous, systematic review. She wasn't burdened by the emotional weight of the original investigation. She saw the case not as a haunting failure, but as a complex puzzle waiting for a fresh set of eyes to solve it. Her first official act was to have the entire, voluminous case file, every report, every witness statement, every scribbled note, scanned and digitized. She spent weeks sequestered in her office, the glow of her dual monitors reflecting in her focused eyes, building a digital timeline, cross-referencing names, and searching for the anomalies that the original investigators, overwhelmed and working with paper and pins on a map, might have missed. It was in this digital archaeology that she found the first crack. She flagged the interview with Raymond Finch. On the surface, it was unremarkable. But Rossi, with the benefit of hindsight and modern investigative tools, saw something more. The alibi he had provided, a diner receipt from 4:45 p.m., was flimsy at best. In 1975, it might have seemed solid. In 2014, Rossi knew it proved nothing. A person could commit a crime at 3:30 and still be at a diner an hour later. The receipt established a timeline, but it didn't create an alibi for the crucial window of time when the girls had disappeared. She dug deeper into Finch. His name, when run through modern databases, painted a much darker picture than the one available in 1975. While he had no major convictions, a pattern of minor offenses followed him as he drifted from state to state over the years. A disorderly conduct charge in Delaware, a peeping Tom complaint in North Carolina that was later dropped. They were small things, but together they sketched the outline of a man who lived on the fringes, a man with an unhealthy interest in watching others. Then, Rossi decided to do something the original team couldn't. She began the painstaking process of re-interviewing any surviving witnesses. Most were now in their 60s or 70s, their memories clouded by time. But one interview stood out. A woman who had been a teenager working at a lemonade stand in 1975 mentioned something she'd told an officer back then, something that had never made it into the primary summary reports. She remembered seeing the man who ran the Ferris wheel, a quiet, lanky fellow, talking to the twin girls near the merry-go-round earlier in the afternoon. She remembered it because he seemed awkward, and the girls looked a little uncomfortable. Rossi went back to the digital files, searching for the original officer's notes from that specific interview. Buried deep in an auxiliary folder, she found it. A brief, almost illegible notation. Witness states Ferris wheel operator spoke with girls. Subject is Ray Finch. Finch denies interaction. The discrepancy was never followed up on. It was a single loose thread in a tapestry of chaos. Rossi felt a surge of adrenaline. She now had a suspect who had lied about his interaction with the victims on the day they disappeared. But she needed more. She needed to understand the man who had missed this thread. She found Frank Miller living in a small retirement community inland, a quiet man in his late 80s with faded blue eyes that still held a shadow of the old case. Rossi visited him on a crisp autumn afternoon, bringing a binder with her. She didn't come to blame or second guess. She came seeking the one thing technology couldn't give her: instinct. She sat with him in his sunlit living room, the scent of old books and pipe tobacco in the air. She laid out the facts she had uncovered, speaking with a quiet respect. Miller listened intently, his hands clasped over the head of his cane. "Finch," Miller said, his voice a gravelly whisper. "I remember him. Nervous. Too nervous. There was nothing in the official file about your suspicions, Frank," Rossi said gently. Miller's gaze drifted to a dusty bookshelf. "It wasn't official. It was just a feeling. In those days, a feeling wasn't enough. We were chasing phantoms, Izzy, hundreds of them. He just got lost in the noise." He sighed, a sound heavy with the weight of decades. "I kept a personal notebook. Always did. Maybe I wrote something down." He shuffled over to an old wooden chest in the corner and, after a moment of searching, pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. Its pages were brittle and brown. He licked his thumb and carefully turned the pages, his old eyes squinting at his own faded handwriting. He stopped, his finger tracing a line of ink. He looked up at Rossi, and for the first time, she saw the sharp detective he once was flicker back to life in his eyes. He read the line aloud. "Finch. Something not right, but nothing to hold him." Rossi leaned forward, her heart pounding. It was the confirmation she needed. The gut feeling of the old-school cop, combined with the digital evidence she had unearthed, was finally pointing in one undeniable direction. The ghost that had haunted Frank Miller for 40 years suddenly had a name, and now it was her job to find him. The trail to Raymond Finch was not a difficult one for Detective Rossi to follow, but it was a long and lonely one. It led her away from the familiar salt-laced air of the Jersey Shore, through a series of database queries and public records that painted a portrait of a life lived in the shadows. Finch had never stayed in one place for long. He drifted through a dozen states, working menial jobs, a stock boy in Pennsylvania, a handyman in Georgia, a night watchman in Alabama. He had no wife, no children, no digital footprint to speak of. He was a man trying to be invisible. His trail ended in the humid, sun-bleached landscape of rural Central Florida. He was living in a rusted, single-wide mobile home at the end of a dusty, unpaved road, surrounded by overgrown sawgrass and skeletal-looking cypress trees draped in Spanish moss. The address itself felt like a metaphor for his life, isolated, forgotten, and slowly decaying under the relentless sun. Rossi flew down to Florida alone. She didn't bring a partner or a local escort. This was not an arrest. It was a conversation. A delicate, strategic move in a game that had been dormant for nearly 40 years. She knew that a full frontal assault with flashing lights and a warrant would likely cause Finch to retreat behind a wall of lawyers and silence. She needed to see him in his own environment, to gauge the man he had become, and to plant a seed of doubt that she hoped would grow into a confession. She drove her rental car down the bumpy dirt road, a plume of white dust rising behind her. Finch's trailer was even more dilapidated up close than it had appeared in satellite images. The screens on the windows were torn, a collection of old tires and rusted engine parts littered the yard, and a single, scraggly palm tree drooped sadly near the front steps. She parked the car, took a deep, steadying breath, and walked up the rickety wooden steps. The air was thick and still, buzzing with the sound of insects. She knocked on the flimsy metal door. The sound was flat and hollow, quickly absorbed by the oppressive humidity. For a long moment, there was no response. She was about to knock again when the door creaked open a few inches. A sliver of a face appeared in the darkness within, pale, deeply wrinkled, with a pair of watery, suspicious eyes peering out at her. "Can I help you?" a reedy voice asked. It was the voice of an old man, thin and devoid of warmth. "Mr. Raymond Finch?" Rossi asked, her tone polite and professional. The eyes narrowed. "Who's asking?" "My name is Detective Isabella Rossi. I'm with the Haven Point Police Department in New Jersey." She watched him closely, studying his reaction. There was no flicker of surprise, no look of confusion. Instead, a kind of weary resignation settled over his features, as if he had been expecting this knock on his door for his entire life. The door opened wider. "You'd best come inside," he said, turning and shuffling back into the dim interior. The inside of the trailer was cluttered and smelled of stale cigarette smoke and dust. Old newspapers were stacked in precarious piles, and dirty dishes filled a small sink. Finch lowered himself heavily into a worn-out armchair, the springs groaning in protest. He was a thin, stooped man, swallowed by a faded flannel shirt. He looked frail, almost pathetic. But Rossi had seen enough evil in her career to know that it often wore the most unassuming disguises. She remained standing, a deliberate choice to maintain a position of authority. "Haven Point," Finch said, more to himself than to her. "Haven't heard that name in a long time." "We're reviewing an old case, Mr. Finch," Rossi began, her voice calm and even. "A cold case from the summer of 1975. He didn't respond, just stared at a spot on the dirty linoleum floor. His hands, spotted with age, rested on his knees, and Rossi noticed his knuckles were white. "We're looking into the disappearance of 2 girls," she continued, letting the words hang in the still, hot air. "Laura and Sarah Peterson." She watched his face. A muscle twitched in his jaw, a tiny, almost imperceptible tremor. It was the only sign that her words had landed. He remained silent, a stubborn, unmoving wall of denial built over decades. Rossi knew she had gone as far as she could for now. Pushing for answers would be fruitless. Her purpose here was not to get a confession today. It was to let him know that the past was no longer buried. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a photograph. It was a copy of the girl's last school picture, the one that had been plastered on all the posters. 2 bright, smiling faces, frozen in time. She stepped forward and placed it gently on the cluttered coffee table in front of him. Finch flinched as if the small piece of paper were hot to the touch. His eyes darted to the photo, then quickly away, as if he couldn't bear to look at it. "They deserve to come home, Mr. Finch," Rossi said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, imbued with a quiet, steely resolve. Their parents have been waiting for a very long time. She turned and walked to the door without another word. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She could feel his eyes on her, and she knew the image of those two smiling girls was now seared into the suffocating silence of his small, lonely world. The seed had been planted. Now, all she had to do was wait for it to break through the surface. Detective Rossi's visit was like a stone tossed into a stagnant pond. On the surface, after the initial splash, the water seems to settle. But underneath, everything is disturbed, and the mud that has lain dormant for decades begins to churn and rise. For Raymond Finch, the placid surface of his solitary life had been shattered. In the days following Rossi's departure, an unmarked sedan with tinted windows would park at the end of Finch's dusty road, a silent, patient observer. Inside, a rotating team of local Florida deputies, working at Rossi's request, kept a log of his every move. At first, there was little to report. Finch kept to his reclusive routine, a trip to the corner store for groceries, an hour spent sitting on his porch, smoking one cigarette after another, his gaze fixed on the empty road. But the log began to note changes. Small at first, then more significant. The lights inside his trailer, which had always been extinguished by 9 o'clock, now burned late into the night. The deputies on the midnight shift would report seeing his silhouette pacing back and forth behind the tattered curtains, a restless shadow moving in a cage of his own making. The photograph Rossi had left behind sat on his coffee table, a constant, silent accusation amidst the clutter. He would try to ignore it, to cover it with a newspaper or an old magazine, but his eyes were always drawn back to it. Two smiling girls, Laura and Sarah. Their names, which he had successfully buried under 40 years of willful forgetting, now echoed in the silence of his trailer. His nights became a torment. Sleep offered no escape. When he did manage to drift off, his dreams were a chaotic collage of fragmented memories he had long suppressed. The sound of the surf organ on the boardwalk, the sweet, cloying smell of cotton candy, the high-pitched, innocent laughter of two girls. And then, a darker memory, one he fought with all his might. The feeling of sand under his knees, the weight of a terrible, irreversible act, and the panicked, frantic rush to erase what he had done. He would wake up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding, the sound of his own ragged breathing filling the small, dark room. He began talking to himself, his voice a low, rambling mumble that the surveillance team's long-range microphones occasionally picked up. Fragments of sentences. Shouldn't have, never should have. And that cop. She knows. The wall of silence he had so carefully constructed around himself for 39 years was beginning to crumble, brick by brick. He was a man coming undone. 2 weeks after Rossi's visit, the surveillance log recorded a significant event. Finch made a phone call from a payphone at a gas station miles from his home, a clear attempt to avoid being monitored. The team traced the call. It was to a cousin in Georgia, a man named Earl. The conversation was brief and guarded, but the key phrases, picked up by a court-authorized wiretap, were chillingly clear. "They're digging again, Earl," Finch's reedy voice said, tight with panic. "About Jersey. Back in '75. There was a pause on the other end. "What do you mean digging?" Earl's voice was gruff, wary. "A cop came. A woman. She knows something. You keep your mouth shut, you hear me?" Earl snapped. "It's been 40 years. There's nothing to know. Nothing's there." The call confirmed Rossi's suspicion. Finch was not the only one who held the secret. But more importantly, it showed he was scared. He was reaching out, seeking reassurance, a sign that his confidence was shattered. The final crack in the wall appeared a week later. On a Tuesday morning, the surveillance team watched as Finch got into his old, rust-pocked pickup truck and drove to a dusty, second-hand hardware store in a neighboring town. He went inside and emerged 10 minutes later with a single item, a brand-new, long-handled shovel, its metal blade gleaming in the harsh Florida sun. He threw it into the bed of the truck and drove back to his trailer. The report landed on Rossi's desk in Haven Point almost immediately. A picture of Finch carrying the shovel was attached. A cold, professional calm settled over her. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The seed of doubt she had planted had finally taken root and was now forcing Finch to act. A man who has successfully hidden a secret for 4 decades doesn't suddenly buy a shovel unless he believes his hiding place is no longer safe. He was going back. He was going to try to move what he had buried, or perhaps to dig up something he had left behind. The question that hung in the air in the Haven Point incident room was no longer if Finch was guilty. It was what he was about to do. And as Rossi stared at the photograph of the old man and his new shovel, she knew her patient, psychological game was over. The time for waiting had passed. It was time to follow the ghost back to his grave. The shovel lay in the bed of Raymond Finch's pickup truck for 3 days, a silent, gleaming portent of action to come. For the surveillance teams in both Florida and New Jersey, these were days of heightened, nerve-wracking anticipation. Every time Finch emerged from his trailer, every time he so much as glanced at his truck, a wave of adrenaline surged through the watching officers. They were a spring, coiled and ready, waiting for the final, decisive movement. Detective Rossi coordinated from her desk in Haven Point, her phone a constant link to the teams on the ground, her mind racing through every possible scenario. The move came on a Friday, just after dusk, as the sky over Florida bled from orange to a deep, starless indigo. Finch emerged from his trailer. He didn't hesitate. He climbed into his truck, started the engine with a protesting groan, and pulled onto the dusty road, heading north. The silent pursuit began. It was a carefully choreographed ballet of law enforcement, spanning multiple states. Unmarked cars from different jurisdictions seamlessly picked up the tail as Finch's truck rumbled across state lines, a lonely speck of light moving through the vast darkness of the American South. He drove through the night, stopping only for gas and cheap, greasy food at roadside diners where he sat alone, staring into a cup of black coffee, his face a mask of grim determination. He wasn't just running from something. He was running toward it. Rossi and a small team flew out of Atlantic City, timing their arrival to coincide with Finch's. They landed in the cool, pre-dawn air of New Jersey and set up a mobile command post in an unmarked van parked in a deserted lot on the outskirts of Haven Point. They watched on a screen as a GPS tracker, surreptitiously placed on Finch's truck at a gas stop in Virginia, showed his steady progress up the Garden State Parkway. He was coming home. He arrived in Haven Point just as the first gray light of dawn was beginning to soften the edges of the night. The town was asleep, the boardwalk a skeletal silhouette against the lightening sky. But Finch did not drive toward the familiar streets of the town center. He took the winding coastal road north, the same road Rossi had taken months ago, toward the undeveloped dunes. "He's heading for the original search area," Rossi said, her voice a low, steady command in the tense silence of the van. "All units, hold your positions. Do not engage. I want to see what he does. I want to see where he goes." Finch parked his truck on the shoulder of the deserted road, the same spot where Sergeant Connolly had parked on the day he'd found the gravesite. He got out, his movements stiff and slow in the chilly morning air. He reached into the back of the truck and grabbed the new shovel. With a last, furtive look up and down the empty road, he trudged over the small embankment and disappeared into the labyrinth of dunes and seagrass. From a distance, hidden behind the crest of a dune, Rossi watched him through a pair of powerful binoculars. He moved with a strange, shambling purpose, his eyes scanning the ground. He seemed disoriented, as if trying to recall a map from a faded, 40-year-old memory. He walked past the now unmarked spot where Scout had made his discovery, continuing deeper into the dunes. The forensic team had been meticulous, leaving no trace of their excavation, and the wind and sand had done the rest, smoothing the surface over as if nothing had ever been disturbed. Finally, Finch stopped. He stood near a small, gnarled scrub pine, its branches twisted by a lifetime of salty wind. He stared at the spot for a long moment, then dropped to his knees. He began to claw at the sand with his bare hands, a desperate, animalistic motion. Finding nothing, he stood up, grabbed the shovel, and plunged it into the ground. "That's it," Rossi said quietly into her radio. "Go." The world erupted. From every direction, figures in dark tactical gear rose from the dunes, materializing from the landscape like avenging spirits. The quiet morning was shattered by the sharp command, "Police! Drop the shovel. Get on the ground." Finch froze, the shovel halfway through a swing. His head snapped up, his face a canvas of pure, unadulterated shock and terror. The shovel clattered from his grasp onto the sand. For a moment, he looked as if he might run, but there was nowhere to go. He was surrounded, a frail old man trapped in a circle of armed officers, the culmination of a hunt that had spanned for decades. He slowly, shakily, lowered himself to his knees, then onto his stomach, his face pressed into the cold, damp sand he had come to disturb. An officer cuffed his hands behind his back. The clicks of the handcuffs were sharp, definitive, echoing in the sudden silence. Detective Rossi walked slowly toward him. She didn't run. Her movements were deliberate, imbued with the weight of the moment. She stopped and stood over him, looking down at the man who had haunted this town, this department, and one family in particular, for her entire lifetime. He lay there, defeated, a pathetic figure in the sand. She knelt beside him, her voice low and clear, meant only for him. "You're a little late, Mr. Finch," she said. He turned his head, his cheek grinding against the sand. His eyes were wide with confusion and fear. He had been so sure, so certain that this one last, desperate act would secure his secret forever. Rossi leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper, delivering the final, devastating blow. "What were you looking for, Ray? The little seashell necklace Sarah was wearing? Or was it Laura's silver beret? It doesn't matter. We already found them." She watched as the last bit of fight drained out of him. The confusion in his eyes was replaced by the hollow, vacant look of absolute and total defeat. He knew, in that instant, that it was over. The lie he had lived for 39 years had finally been unearthed. He had come back to bury his past one last time, only to find that it had been waiting for him all along. The interrogation room at the Haven Point Police Department was a small, sterile box, painted a dispassionate shade of gray. It was a room designed to strip away the comforts and defenses of the outside world, leaving a person with nothing but the truth or the lies they chose to cling to. Raymond Finch sat at a small metal table, a single plastic cup of water untouched before him. The bravado, the panic, the desperation he had shown in the dunes had evaporated, replaced by a deep, impenetrable silence. He was a stone, weathered and worn, giving nothing away. For 3 hours, he said nothing. Detective Rossi sat across from him, her posture relaxed but her eyes missing nothing. She didn't press him. She didn't raise her voice or threaten him with the mountain of circumstantial evidence they had accumulated. She knew that after 40 years of silence, shouting would only make him retreat further into himself. Instead, she employed a different strategy. She made the past present. She began to talk, her voice a low, steady murmur. She didn't talk about him. She talked about them. She spoke of Laura's love for books, how she would sit for hours on her front porch, lost in other worlds. She spoke of Sarah's infectious laugh, how the neighbors said you could hear it from a block away. She painted a picture of two vibrant, living girls, filling the sterile room with the ghosts of who they were. She spoke of their mother, Eleanor, and how she still kept their bedroom exactly as they had left it, a perfect, heartbreaking shrine to a single summer afternoon. She spoke of their father, David, and how a part of him had died that day and had never come back. Finch kept his eyes fixed on the table, but Rossi could see the muscles in his jaw working, his thin lips pressed into a white line. The silence in the room was no longer his weapon, it was hers. It was a space she was filling with a truth he could no longer deny. "You took all that away, Ray," she said, her voice softening, becoming almost conversational. "All that life, all that potential. For what? What happened on that beach that was so terrible you had to erase 2 children from the world?" He remained silent. Rossi slid a file across the table. It was the preliminary forensics report from the lab. "The anthropologists," she said, tapping the cover. "They're very good at what they do. They can read stories from bones, Ray. They told us Laura had a defensive fracture on her left ulna." She paused, letting the clinical term sink in. "That's the bone in the forearm. It means she raised her arm to protect herself. Or maybe," Rossi's voice dropped, heavy with meaning, "she was trying to protect her sister." That was the key, the small, heroic detail that Finch alone would know. A sound, low and guttural, escaped Finch's throat. It was the sound of a wall cracking, of a dam about to break. He shook his head slowly, a barely perceptible motion. "I didn't mean to," he whispered, his voice a dry, rasping sound, like dead leaves skittering across pavement. It was the first time he had spoken in hours. Rossi waited, her expression unchanged. She gave him the silence he needed to continue. I just wanted to talk to them," he said, his gaze still fixed on the table, as if the whole story were written there. "They were always so happy laughing. I saw them on the boardwalk. They were pretty." The word hung in the air, ugly and predatory. "I followed them when they started walking home, down the beach. I told them I knew a shortcut through the dunes, a place where you could find the best seashells." He paused, swallowing hard. "They were good kids. They said no. They said their parents told them not to talk to strangers. Sarah, she was the spunky one. She said, 'We have to go home for dinner.' And she took her sister's hand, and they started to walk away." His breathing became shallow, his words more fragmented. Something snapped. "I got angry. Why were they walking away? I was just trying to be friendly." I grabbed Sarah's arm. She screamed, just a little scream. And then Laura, the quiet one, she turned around and she got between us. She put her little arms out and said, "Leave my sister alone." Finch's eyes finally lifted from the table and met Rossi's. They were filled with a strange, horrifying mix of self-pity and remembered rage. She looked at me like I was dirt. This little 12-year-old girl. And I lost it. I hit her. I didn't mean to hit her so hard. He was crying now, silent, wretched tears that tracked paths through the grime on his old face. She fell, and she didn't get up. Sarah started screaming then, really screaming. And I knew I couldn't let her scream. I couldn't let anyone know. He didn't need to say the rest. The story was there in the forensics report, in the fractures and the trauma etched into the bones. He described the terrible minutes that followed, not with the graphic detail of a monster glorying in his work, but with the detached, rambling confusion of a man recounting a nightmare. He spoke of the panic, the frantic search for a place to hide what he had done, the digging in the sand with his bare hands under the fading light of the summer sky. He confessed to taking Laura's barrette and Sarah's cheap seashell necklace, not as trophies, but in a panicked attempt to remove anything that could identify them, stuffing them in his pocket. These were the items he had gone back to find, the last nagging pieces of evidence his guilty mind could not forget. When he was finished, a profound exhaustion settled over him. He slumped in his chair, a hollowed-out shell of a man. The secret he had carried for 39 years, a weight that had stooped his shoulders and soured his soul, was finally out. Rossi sat in the silence for a long moment, letting the full, ugly truth of it fill the room. There was no grand motive, no complex conspiracy. There was only a moment of pathetic, explosive rage from a lonely, angry man, and a lifetime of consequences. The confession wasn't an apology. It was an excuse, the final, cowardly act of a man who had stolen 2 lives and had spent the rest of his own trying to justify it to himself. It was the banal, terrible, and deeply human heart of the crime. After the confession was signed and Raymond Finch was led away to a holding cell, a different kind of silence fell over the Haven Point police station. It wasn't the tense silence of an ongoing investigation, but a heavy, contemplative quiet. The puzzle was solved. The monster had been caged. But the work was not yet finished. There was one final, monumental task to perform, a duty that felt heavier than the entire investigation combined. Detective Rossi knew it fell to her. She retreated to the quiet of her office, closing the door on the low hum of the station. The file on the Peterson case lay open on her desk, but she didn't look at it. She looked instead at the phone number written on a small, clean sheet of paper. It was the number for the Peterson home in a quiet suburb of Philadelphia, where they had moved years ago to escape the ghosts of Haven Point. For nearly 40 years, this call had been the impossible hope and the unbearable dread of the Peterson family. Every ring of the phone had carried with it a split second of what if. What if it was news? What if it was a false alarm? What if it was the call that would change everything? Now, that call was about to be made. Rossi rehearsed the words in her head, but they felt clumsy and inadequate. How do you tell parents in their late 70s that the nightmare they have lived for their entire adult lives is finally over? How do you deliver news that is simultaneously a source of profound relief and a confirmation of their deepest, most long-held sorrow? There was no training for this, no protocol. There was only human decency and a deep, abiding respect for the weight of their grief. She picked up the receiver, her hand steady, and dialed the number. She listened to the rings, each one seeming to last an eternity. 1, 2, 3. Hello, a man's voice answered. It was older, a little thin, but clear. Mr. David Peterson? Rossi asked, her own voice softer than she intended. Yes, this is he. There was a note of caution in his tone, the practiced reserve of a man who had been disappointed by official-sounding phone calls too many times before. Mr. Peterson, my name is Detective Isabella Rossi. I'm with the Haven Point Police Department. I'm the lead investigator on your daughter's case. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Rossi could hear the faint sound of a television in the background. Then, she heard another sound, a rustling, and a woman's voice asking, David? Who is it? It's the police, Eleanor, he said, his voice now tight with a sudden, palpable tension. From Haven Point. Rossi heard him take a deep breath. What is it, detective? Have you found something else? His question was laden with the weariness of a man who expected another dead end, another minor detail leading nowhere. Yes, sir, we have, Rossi said, choosing her words with infinite care. We've made an arrest. The silence that followed was absolute. It was so profound that Rossi thought for a moment the line had gone dead. She could picture them in their living room, two elderly people frozen in time, the words hanging in the air between them. An arrest. David finally whispered, the word barely audible. It was not a question of disbelief, but one of dawning, fragile hope. Yes, sir, Rossi confirmed. The man's name is Raymond Finch. He was a boardwalk employee in the summer of 1975. She paused, then delivered the crucial blow. He has made a full confession, Mr. Peterson. He told us everything that happened. This time, she heard a sound on the other end, a soft, choked sob. It was Eleanor. She could hear David murmuring to her, It's all right, Elle. It's all right. David came back on the line, his voice thick with emotion he was struggling to control. He's alive? After all this time? The man who did this is still alive. Yes, sir. He is in our custody. For the next few minutes, Rossi answered their questions. They were simple, direct, the questions of parents needing to understand the end of a long, dark road. Where did he live? How did you find him? Was he alone? She answered each one with a calm, factual gentleness, omitting the brutal details of the crime itself. Those could wait. This moment was not about the horror, it was about the closure. She could hear the tectonic plates of their lives shifting through the phone line. The 40-year-old burden of not knowing was beginning to lift. It was a weight so immense, so constant, that its absence was a physical sensation, a terrifying and liberating lightness. All these years, Eleanor's voice came on the line now, surprisingly clear, though trembling. All these years, we wondered. We imagined every terrible thing. We wondered if they suffered. We wondered if they were scared. Her voice broke. We just wanted to know. He told us they were together until the very end, Mrs. Peterson, Rossi said softly, offering the only piece of comfort she could. He said Laura was trying to protect Sarah. They weren't alone. It was the right thing to say. A fresh wave of quiet weeping came through the phone, but this time it sounded different. It was the sound not just of grief, but of release. A release from the tyranny of the unknown. Before they hung up, David's voice came back, firm and resolute. Thank you, detective, he said, and the simple gratitude in his voice was more powerful than any accolade Rossi had ever received. Thank you for not forgetting them, for not letting them just be a story in an old newspaper. He paused, his voice catching. Now we can bring our girls home. Rossi put the phone down, leaning back in her chair, a profound sense of exhaustion washing over her. She stared at the case file, at the smiling faces of Laura and Sarah. The file was finally, truly, coming to an end. Justice, in its slow, grinding, and often imperfect way, had arrived. It had come 40 years too late, but for the two people on the other end of that phone call, it had come just in time. The ghosts of Haven Point could finally begin to rest. The legal proceedings against Raymond Finch were swift and conclusive. Faced with his own detailed confession and the irrefutable forensic evidence, there was no trial. He pled guilty to 2 counts of murder, a stooped, broken old man in a courtroom, mumbling his plea to a judge who sentenced him to spend the rest of his natural life in a prison cell, a fate he accepted with the same weary resignation he had shown since the moment of his capture. For the public and the press, the sentencing was the end of the story. The monster was locked away, the case closed. But for David and Eleanor Peterson, The true final chapter was not written in a courtroom. It was written on a quiet, windswept afternoon in late autumn, back at Haven Point. They did not want a traditional funeral. There would be no casket, no headstone in a cemetery. After 40 years of being trapped in the earth, they felt their daughters deserved to be free. Following the legal proceedings, the girls' remains were cremated, their ashes placed together in a simple, unadorned wooden box. On a Tuesday, when the beach was nearly deserted and the sky was a high, pale blue, David and Eleanor returned. They were accompanied only by Detective Rossi, whom they had insisted on having with them. They walked slowly across the sand, their feet sinking into the familiar ground that had once been the landscape of their worst nightmares. But today, it felt different. The air was clean, the sound of the surf was a steady, rhythmic pulse, like the heartbeat of the world. They walked to a spot overlooking the water, not far from the dunes where Scout had made his discovery. The yellow tape was long gone. The sand was smooth. Nature had already reclaimed the spot, healing the scar on the land. David held the small wooden box in his hands. He and Eleanor stood side by side, their shoulders touching, looking out at the vast expanse of the Atlantic. They didn't speak for a long time. There were no more words left to say that hadn't been said in the quiet conversations and shared tears of the past few weeks. They were simply two parents, standing with their children one last time. Eleanor reached out and placed her hand over David's on the box. "They love the ocean," she said, her voice soft but clear against the wind. They would have wanted this. Together, they opened the box. David tilted it forward, and a fine, gray dust swirled out, caught instantly by the sea breeze. The wind lifted the ashes, carrying them out over the waves in a gentle, dancing plume. For a moment, the ashes seemed to hang in the air, sparkling in the afternoon sun, before dissolving into the sea and the sky, becoming one with the elements they had so loved in their brief lives. They watched until the last visible trace was gone. And as they stood there, a profound and gentle peace settled over them, a quiet that was not empty, but full of memory and love. The 40-year storm inside them had finally broken, leaving a calm, clean stillness in its wake. The constant, agonizing question of where had been answered. They turned to Detective Rossi, who had stood at a respectful distance, giving them their space. "Thank you, Isabella," Eleanor said, using her first name for the first time. She reached out and took the young detective's hand. "You gave us back our peace. You gave our daughters back their names." Rossi simply nodded, unable to speak, her own eyes misty. This was why she did the job. Not for the thrill of the chase or the satisfaction of an arrest, but for this. For the small, sacred moments of closure that allowed people to begin to heal. They walked back to the car in comfortable silence. As they left Haven Point, David looked back one last time at the dunes and the endless ocean. The ghosts were no longer there. The town was no longer a place of haunting, but a place of memory, a repository of a happy time before the world had broken. In the years that followed, the story of the Peterson twins became something new in Haven Point. It was no longer a cautionary tale whispered in fear, but a story of resilience, of a community's long memory, and of a detective who refused to let a cold case stay cold. The name Frank Miller was remembered with respect, and the name Izzy Rossi with gratitude. And sometimes, on quiet days, Sergeant Connolly would bring his new K-9 partner to the North Dunes for training, and he would stop for a moment near the spot where Scout, his long-retired partner, had changed everything. He would look out at the water and think of the two girls who had been lost, and then, finally, found. The wind still blows across the dunes of Haven Point, carrying the scent of salt and thyme. But for those who know the story, it no longer carries the whisper of a buried secret. It carries the faint, joyful echo of two sisters laughing, forever 12, forever free, their spirits finally at home in the vast, eternal rhythm of the sea. And so, the story of Laura and Sarah Peterson and the long shadow cast by their disappearance finally comes to a close. For nearly 40 years, their memory was a question mark, a painful void. But thanks to the instinct of a K-9 named Scout and the unwavering dedication of a new generation of investigators, their story found its final chapter, one of justice, peace, and a family's enduring love. It's a story that leaves us with so much to think about. The quiet heroism of Detective Rossi, the heavy burden carried by Detective Miller, and the profound strength of the Peterson family. I'm left wondering about Detective Rossi's final, quiet act of comfort for the family. What do you think of her decision to focus on how the sisters were together in the end, rather than the horrific details of the crime? If you were in her shoes, would you have done anything differently? Please, share your thoughts in the comments below. I truly do read every single one, and I believe our conversations here are what bring these stories to life. If this story made you think, or made you feel something, please don't forget to leave a like. It helps more than you know. Share it with someone you believe would also be moved by this journey. And if you haven't already, please consider subscribing so you don't miss the next mystery we unravel together. I'll meet you in the next story. And who knows, maybe next time, you'll be the one to tell a truth that was once buried.